Can you be buried on your land in North Carolina?
Yes, maybe, probably. So there's no North Carolina law as far as can you be buried on your own property. That is actually a local ordinance, and most places you can be, but should you? So
Can you be buried in Chatham County?
yes, but should you?
Okay.
So yeah, you can either coordinate with your funeral director or with your state, or you can do it yourself and work it out with the county. So you go to the county clerk and you get an application for that. You do have to have, if you're going to have a body buried in a coffin or a pine box, you do have to have that surveyed, and you do have to have an easement for visitation. And so that's a little bit complicated. And people always say, well, what difference does it make? I don't care if anybody visits me. I just want to be buried on my property. The county doesn't like that because there might be a long lost nephew that wants to visit Uncle Bob that's buried on DeWitt Smith Road, and you have to grant them access. So they're going to require you to have an easement.
I was going to say, what are they going to do to you if you get buried there? Anyways.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So I mean, well, there are laws and rules and everything, and so it's still happening today. I mean, I've had friends that have done it, and I just walked a piece of property. Yesterday that had a buried urn. Now, it was a pine box urn. That person was buried 10 years ago. They just wanted to be buried on the land, and they didn't have any family that's visiting them, but it's still a required easement. That's an encumbrance on the property. That not everybody is going to like the fact that they're buying a piece of property and it has a marked grave
It's there
or an
forever.
urn. It's there forever. It's there forever. And
10,000 years from now.
well, I don't know if there's going to be the United States 10,000 years from now, but hopefully. But it's amazing longevity. I can tell you that I've had issues with cemeteries in Chatham County from the 1800s. So that's pretty close to forever. One of the sad things that I see when I walk pieces of land, and there'll be a family cemetery, they'll have the headstone from 1872, they'll have the headstone from 1894, and they'll have some from 1932 and 1941, but then they'll have just a bunch of small stones, and that's from the flu epidemic of like 1914 to 1917, and lots of old people died and lots of children died, and so and you can see the small dents in the ground, so it was so many burials that they didn't always have time to do a proper tombstone. There's usually a headstone of something, and so I've seen just stones and indentations in the ground, and some kind of a lot of them are marked by GIS in the county. They're supposed to be on a survey as well. There are actually grave locators. So like we did a shopping center here in Chatham County, and when they were looking at the dirt to see whether or not they could put the shopping center there, a guy goes around with rebar hitting the ground. He saw indentations that might have been graves, and sure enough there were some unmarked graves or whatever. So that shopping center, and we won't talk about which shopping center it is, but it had to be built around those graves. They can be moved, but that's a really, really difficult process. So if there are living heirs and living family members, they have rights to visit their ancestors. And you're right, that's that's forever and ever. It goes with the land. So I had a 17-acre tract of land for sale in Silk Cove, and this was probably a time when the land was worth around $120,000, and I had this land for $75,000 because sure enough, there was, and this was a big one. This was like 75 feet by 75 feet, black iron fence. It had a couple 5 and 6 foot headstones. I mean, real monuments. And it had the family name, and there was probably 30, 40 people buried in this.
How big a property was that?
It was 17 acres. So it used to be a much, much bigger farm, but this was the 17 acres that were remaining. And sure enough, that cemetery was smack dab in the middle of the property. And of course, it had an easement. And even though nobody had been buried in that family cemetery for 50 years, it was still maintained by the family. They still weed eated it and kept it clean and everything. And so they had forever rights. Well, this was in Silcope, and the soils weren't all that great. And the area that perked was fairly close to the grave site. And sure enough, I had a Yankee come down from the northeast. And he's like, why is this land so cheap? And I was like, well, we have this cemetery right in the middle. And he's like, doesn't bother me. And so he bought it. He was thrilled that he could buy 17 acres for $75,000. And he came back and visited us several months later after he had built the house. And I asked him how it was out there and how was the cemetery. And he said it was the quietest neighbors he ever had. So, so I mean, but one of the things that you need to consider, so you have this wish to be a part of your land, you want to be buried on your land and everything, you do have to consider the permanence of that. It is, not everybody wants to buy land that has a cemetery on it or even one person buried on it. The other interesting thing is that North Carolina is liberal with cremation remains and ash disposal. So, you know, if you want to be part of the land, it's much better to just spread the ashes around on the property. You are part of the land. There's no easement necessary. There's no disclosure necessary. There's no encumbrance. There's not an actual urn or anything that's buried on the property, and you know the person can become one with the property, and it's not an encumbrance on the property forever and ever.
The whole time you're talking, I'm kind of wondering like how much longer can we go on just
doing this?
People in the ground,
yeah. Well, you know, you look at some urban areas, and it's pretty. I mean, that's some valuable real estate in Chatham County. I mean, we have plenty of land for cemeteries. Whatever. I had a church situation where, I mean, this is quite the situation. A gentleman had 20 acres. He donated 5 acres to the church for a church and a cemetery, and the church maxed out their land and started burying people on the 15 acres, and so. That's quite the situation where you have a cemetery encroachment. That was my first cemetery encroachment, but it's not very common. And if somebody asks me about it, I don't recommend it just because the property is somewhat stigmatized, and there is a devaluation. I don't know what it is. Not everybody has a problem with it. I will say the one that I showed yesterday, that was an urn in a pine box that was 10, 15 years ago. I doubt the box is even in the ground anymore. You know, that's probably been eaten up and long gone or whatever, but that easement's still there.